So for this module on experimental research design, the critical questions includes what are the essential characteristics of experimental design, the threats to internal validity, how can these threats be controlled, what are the different types of experimental designs, and of course highlighting the differentiating factors of these three experimental designs. And so without much further ado, let's begin with our first module, which is on experimental research design. Experimental research design is the only type of research design that directly attempts to influence a particular variable. If properly used, this design will actually allow us to establish a cause and effect relationship between variables of our study. Now, what are these variables of our study? If you may recall, we have our independent variable and our dependent variable. In the context of experimental research design, our independent variable is also referred to as experimental variable or treatment variable, while our dependent variable is referred to as our criterion or outcome variable. The purpose of experimental research design is primarily to establish effect between at least one independent variable on one or more dependent variables. So I would like to stop there first and discuss further some of the keywords. Now, the first keyword is that at least one independent variable. So, would it imply that there will be more than one independent variable in a study? Of course, it depends on your study or in your plan of action in your study. Second, would it also imply that there will be more than one dependent variables in the study? Yes, it may also follow that there may be more than one dependent variables in the study. Again, it depends on the nature of your inquiry. Now, as mentioned a while ago, if the experimental research design is properly applied, it will allow us to test hypotheses of cause and effect relationship. What are then the essential characteristics of experimental research design? There are three essential characteristics. And what are these? This includes comparison of groups, manipulation of independent variable, and randomization. What is then comparison of groups? In a quantitative research design, essentially you are comparing groups. One, which is the experimental group, and the other, which is the control group. The experimental group receives a treatment, while the control group, essentially, no treatment is given to it. What about the manipulation of independent variable? There are three forms of how an independent variable can be manipulated. What are these? One form of variable versus another. Second, presence versus absence. And lastly, varying degrees of the same form. An example of one form of variable versus another is that when one group, the treatment group, is exposed to remote teaching and learning, while the other group, the control group, or the comparison group, is exposed to a face-to-face or the traditional or the residential teaching and learning process. In terms of presence versus absence, you can think of one group to have received a remote teaching and learning with online application, and another group who is receiving also a remote teaching and learning but with no online applications. The third one, the varying degrees of the same form, all receives a remote teaching and learning, but the degree of online applications varies. For example, Group 1 receives a full online remote teaching and learning. The second group, a partial, meaning a blended of online and offline, while the third one is generally an offline remote teaching and learning process. We note as well that our independent variable is treated as categorical variables, meaning they are considered as groups, essentially because, as we mentioned, in an experimental research design, we are comparing groups. The third one, on randomization by selection and assignment, could be put simply as a process of randomly selecting the respondents of the study. After they have been randomly selected, you randomly assign them to the experimental or to the control group. Now, for example, you have a population of 1,000 students, and let us say you randomly select 100 students using a simple random sampling, let's say fishbowl technique. After you have selected your 100 students or 100 samples, you're now going to assign them to control or experimental group. So you will expect that 50 will go to the control group and 50 will go to the experimental group. But the process of doing so is also random. You cannot just say, all right, number yourselves from 1 to 50, you go to the control. Number yourselves, those who were assigned to number 56 to 100, you go to the other group. You cannot do that. You have to make random assignment as well. Now, on top of this, randomization or random assignment is also a control for threat of extraneous variables. So we are now discussing the different threats, and later on we're going to go into other threats of internal validity. So to understand this further, we need to know what is an extraneous variable. An extraneous variable refers to the variable that the researcher may not be aware of. So meaning, during the literature review, the researcher was not able to encounter that this variable would actually affect the outcome of the study. And so, he was not able to control for it. Okay? Now, what is the reason why we need to control for extraneous variables? Essentially, the experimental research design is supposed to establish a cause and effect relationship. So if A affects on B, your certainty of saying that A indeed affects of B must be rooted to the fact that there's no other factor other than A that affects B. Si A lang talaga, dapat wala nang ibang factor. Ngayon, kung meron man at hindi mo yun napaghandaan, ang tawag doon ay extraneous variable. So it is necessary that in the onset of the study, you have to be able to find means to control for these extraneous variables. Now, what are some processes of controlling extraneous variables? We mentioned a while ago the randomization. Second is the matching. What do we mean by matching? So here, you're going to pair the subjects in your study, meaning a certain individual, if your subjects are individual, a certain individual belongs to the control group, and another individual of the same characteristics to that certain individual belongs to the experimental group. So for example, if sex is a factor in the study, you can do matching. A male student or a male subject in the control group must be paired to a male subject in the experimental group. In the same manner, that a female subject in the control group will be paired to a female subject in the experimental group. Another way of controlling for extraneous variables is by holding certain variables constant. So let's go back to our example, sex being a factor that affects the outcome. So if you want to control for it, you can just focus on one particular sex, let's say male. So your subjects would only be about male students, or it would only be about female students, meaning you hold the variable constant. Kasi nga, nakaka-apekto si sex, so sige. So para hindi niya maka-apekto, mga lalaki na lang ang pag-aaralan, o kaya mga babae na lang ang pag-aaralan. Another one is by building the variable into the design. So this is similar to the previous examples that I have shared a while ago. So because sex affects the study, for example, then you have to have equal number of males and equal number of females belonging to the control and experimental group. By doing so, you've built the variable in the design. We also have another one, which is using subject as their own control. Now, how are we going to illustrate this? Frankel and Wallen cited an illustration wherein, I quote, "The assessment of an individual's behavior during a period of time before and after treatment is implemented to see whether changes in behavior occur." So in other words, this is actually analogous to doing an assessment prior the treatment and after the treatment as well. So later on, we're going to discuss that further as we go into pre-tests and post-test design. Then lastly, you could apply a statistical control we call the analysis of covariance. And this will be another topic in quantitative data analysis that we're going to talk about in the near future, maybe in one of the webinars in AFERM. Okay, so at this point, I would like to jump first to the threats of internal validity, because we've already mentioned means of controlling for our extraneous variable, primarily because this extraneous variable, if not controlled, will affect the outcome of the study. In the same manner that these issues, threats to internal validity, also affect the credibility or the trustworthiness of our study. So the same analogy that we presented a while ago, if A affects B, then you have to be certain that there is no other factor causing such effect but A. Otherwise, then there is a degree of threat to internal validity, and your generalizations may be affected. Your conclusions will be, of course, affected for that matter. And in general, the credibility of your research. So what are the different threats of internal validity? Frankel and Wallen identified some threats, but I decided to include a few to operationalize some of the terms that he had presented in his texts. So what are these threats that were identified? First, we have subjects' characteristics. So what do we mean by subjects' characteristics? The demographics of the respondents, their sex, their IQ, their civil status, their race, and other demographics. If these variables are seen as revealed by your literature review to have an effect to the outcome, then if this will be controlled, or if this will not be controlled, then it will become a threat to your study. Another is mortality. What do we mean by mortality? This is a very common threat when you are doing, let's say for example, longitudinal studies, which we'll be discussing later on in our third module. When you talk about these types of studies, normally you are following a group of individuals. You are tracking their performance. And if you are tracking their performance for 3 to 4 years, and if these are your students, you will not be certain that all of them will be staying for the next 4 years. We all know the dropout rates these days. So basically, it is possible that 1 or 3 of them will no longer be part of the study as the study progresses, and that is an issue on mortality. The third is on location. What do we mean by location? This refers to where the study or where the treatment is being implemented. For example, if you conducted a study in one urban area and then you conducted the same study on a rural area, then the results would be basically different because the location itself is primarily different. So there is no point of comparison in the first place, because in the beginning, a priori to it, they are already different. So that is actually a threat attributed to location. The fourth one is instrumentation, and there are 3 subcomponents under instrumentation. So this has something to do with how you develop the instrument. That's one. Second is how the instruments are calibrated. Third is, of course, who gather the data, the characteristics of that person, and perhaps his or her biases. So in general, you have instrument decay. So when you say instrument decay, take for example a certain research wherein a group of teachers are rating students, and each teacher simply rates the students following an unstandardized rubric or subjectively. Basically, you cannot expect that each of these teachers will have the same framework of rating the student. And so there is a certain error in the assessment or in the measurement process that occurs, hence the instrument decay. Another one is the data collector's characteristics. For example, if you have a male data collector versus a female data collector and your respondents are children, then maybe the children, for example, that you are that serves as your respondents are children who have experienced, let's say, maltreatment, forms of abuse, and the perpetrator of such abuse are generally males. For example, this is just an example. I would like to put that on bold, that this is just an example. So the tendency is that if this male respondent or this male data gatherer rather will talk to the respondent, it may actually affect the respondent psychologically. So there is a tendency that the respondent will withhold information or the respondent will not talk to the data gatherer. So that in itself affects the data gathering process. If you compare it to another data gatherer who is a female, who is not perceived as a perpetrator by the respondent. Another one is also on the biases of the data gatherer. So for example, the data gatherer that was gathering the data is fully aware of this particular respondent, and this is someone that is a friend of his or her family. So if they were asked to rate the respondents, then maybe there will be a certain bias to that particular student because he or she knew the student in the first place. So he or she may favor the student in terms of the assessment process. Testing. Now, testing is underscored to have something to do with the effects of pretesting. What do we mean by this? The distance between the pretesting and the post-testing should be substantial, in such a manner that the student will not answer the post-test simply on a simple recall of the pretest. And it is also in that the same notion that when we design our post-test, we design it as a parallel form to the pretest, but not exactly the same, because we all know that our students, our subjects, our respondents may simply rely on simple recall, and that is where effect of pretesting would come in as an example of testing as a threat to internal validity. Another threat to internal validity is history. What do we mean by history? This pertains to the events that happen before the study that was conducted or while in the course of the study. So what are these events? There are a lot, no, that may happen along the way. For example, if you are doing a particular experimental research study about the effect of a learning design or a teaching design to students' performance, and then it just so happened that this student was able to learn about the content of the course beforehand, or the content of the course from another media. So that in itself affects the entire integrity of the study, because again your assumption was that the reason why the student excelled was because of A. The outcome B was attributed to A, but the narratives are telling us differently. It is telling us that there is something else that happened along the way that contributes to the outcome, and not your treatment variable, or not your experiment in general. Now, another one related to that is actually maturation, and this is basically underscored as related to individual growth. Meaning, nagkataon lang na nag-grow na yung estudyante, nag-grow na yung bata, natuto na siyang magbilang in the first place. If your study has something to do with identifying, or if your study has something to do with improving students' mathematical skills, that maybe the student was just they just simply matured, and the conduct of the experiment was not attributed to, or the outcome rather was not attributed to the experiment, but simply on the maturity of the student. They simply matured. We also have attitude of subjects, and this is where I'm introducing two aspects: the Hawthorne versus the John Henry effects. Now, what is this Hawthorne and John Henry effects in the first place? Now, the Hawthorne effect have something to do with the student trying to make up for their losses, and the John Henry effect have something to do with the students making up for something because they know they were given something. What I'm trying to say is that in Hawthorne effects, the students are actually working very hard because they knew that they are part of the experiment. While in the John Henry effects, the control group learned that they are not part of the experiment, and that's why they've worked double to compensate for what they did not receive, and hence attributed to an outcome. So the attitude of the subjects towards the entire experimental process actually affects the results of the study. So it becomes a threat now to internal validity. Regression. This is the second to the last under our threats to internal validity, has something to do with the situations wherein your respondents are already on the extreme scores. What do we mean by this? Let's say you have a group of students who were selected in the first place because they have extreme scores. Nag-pretest ka, 1 to 100, their score is already 95. May iaangat pa ba? Baka mag-regress instead. So you see, because they are already at the end of the spectrum, their movement towards the optimum outcome, let's say in a 100 item test, no? 95 na ang pre-test 5 points na lang ang iaangat doon sa post-test, no? So basically, there is the degree of regression. We can also look at the degree of regression when you compare two groups. Let's say the control group and the experimental group. The experimental group mean score for their pretest is 95. The control group is 50. The 95 students, or the students who had a mean score of 95 scored perfectly in the post-test. So they now have 100 in the post-test. And then for the control group, they scored 90 in the post-test. So if you look at the difference now, the difference is 5 for the experimental, and the difference for the control group, 50 to 90, is already 40. So there is a degree of regression, because the assumption there is that it is supposed to be the experimental group who would acquire much bigger difference, much bigger improvement over than the control group who are not actually given the particular treatment of the study. Now let's go to J, which is on implementation. And this is on the instructor's characteristics or researcher's biases. So again, J on implementation is related to instrumentation, data collectors, characteristics, and bias. Alright, so those are some of the threats of internal validity. And I would like you to take note of this, because as we present to you the different designs, the different quantitative, the different experimental research designs, rather, I'm going to present what are the threats of this particular designs as well. And I've coded them as A, B, C, D, D.1 for decay, D.2 for data collectors characteristics, and D.3 for bias, E for testing, F for history, and so on and so forth. All right. Now, before we close our topic on threats of internal validity, here are some of the advice that are given to us by Frankel and Wallin in 2008. First is, you have to examine known factors that may affect the dependent variable. And this is where your extensive literature review will actually come in. Because without the extensive literature review, we will not be able to learn what are factors that have been studied, known to have an effect to your dependent variable. Now, after knowing this, you need to judge whether the comparison group initially differs based on these factors. What do we mean by initially differs? This is where your pretest would actually come in. What is the purpose of the pretest in the first place? This is where you are going to level off the respondents or the subjects. This is where you are going to say, oh, they are primarily of the same performance in the first place, so I can compare them. In our previous example, the treatment group's pretest score is 90. The controls group's pretest score is 50. So basically, there is a degree of difference there. So you can look at what is the composition of your experimental, what is the composition of your control group, and maybe you can do a little tweaking on your groupings so that you would be able to circumvent this particular threat. And that is where you're going to come up with a plan on how you're going to control for such threat. I would like to reiterate some of the modalities on how the extraneous variables are actually controlled, and these are one way or another that you can actually think of as well in controlling for your threats of internal validity. Again, if I may, randomization, conduct matching, because you've seen that that there is difference in the comparison groups, so you include that in your matching criteria. You hold a certain variable constant, you build it into the design, use subjects as their own control, or use analysis of covariance for that aspect. So again, these modalities that were used to control for extraneous variables may be also used in controlling for threats of internal validity. That is, if you were able to identify them beforehand. So the key is identification. We need to identify first who are the patients. Alright. Okay. Now let's go to the different designs. Pseudo designs. These are referred to as weak experimental designs. Why are they weak experimental designs in the first place? Because these types of designs are actually there are basically a lot of threats to internal validity when you use weak designs. What do we mean by a lot of threats? The first two designs, one-shot case study and one group pretest post-test design, do not have controls for any of the internal validity threats that we have mentioned. So it's really problematic because there are a lot of risks that are to be considered. No? So the one-shot case study, the one group pretest post-test design do not have controls for all of the threats of internal validity that we have mentioned. But when you go farther, the static group comparison design and the static group pretest post-test design, there are already certain levels of controls that are present to it. However, these levels of controls are still minimal if you compare it to other types of experimental research design. So let's try to look at each of these weak experimental designs and explore how we can apply this given a particular scenario. So one-shot case study design. Here, simple. There's a treatment and then you observed. Now let's try to illustrate this. Situation. A researcher wants to determine if flexible learning mechanism of DepEd improves study habits. So in a one-shot case study, what the researcher will simply do is treatment. The teacher uses a flexible learning mechanism for a school year. After using the flexible learning mechanism, the teacher measured students' study habits at the end of the school year and claimed that study habits of the students as observed at the end of the school year is attributed to flexible learning mechanism. So that is actually where the big question is coming in, because primarily he just implemented a treatment and then measured without actually knowing the status of the students before the treatment in the first place. So let's move to the next one group pretest post-test design. Here, this is quite different from the previous design because, as mentioned, the previous design there is only one observation at the end of the treatment. But in here, pretest post-test design, one group, there was already a pretest that was conducted prior to the treatment. And then after the treatment was given, there was a post-test that was conducted. So following the same situation, this is the same situation that we're going to consider all throughout the illustration or all throughout our discussion. So what will happen is that there will be a pretest, the treatment, and then there will be a post-test. So the pretest now and the post-test will then be compared to judge whether was there an improvement in study habits, or was there a decline in study habits, or was there just no difference at all. So at least in here, there was a baseline information that is actually being used. But again, let me remind you, both one group pretest post-test design and one-shot case study design do not have controls for all of the internal validity threats that we have mentioned. Now let's move to the third amongst the weak experimental research design, the static group comparison design. So here, two existing or intact groups are used. These groups are non-equivalent nor randomly assigned. So intact groups, what do we mean by that? There were just two classes that were used. There was no consideration as to whether these classes are of equal characteristics in terms of performance. Basta, intact group, dalawang grupo ang kailangan, gumamit ng dalawang grupo. So that is just the static group comparison design. So let's illustrate this. So in the static group comparison design, there is actually a certain group that the teacher introduces the flexible learning mechanism, which is your treatment group. And then the measure, or after the flexible learning mechanism has been introduced for a school year, there was a measurement for study habits by the end of the school year. Now the other group retains the original face-to-face teaching and learning process, residential, and then at the end of the school year, there was also a measurement. So in this case, we are seeing that there is a certain sense of the comparison. Why? Because you are comparing two groups. The only difference is that there was a failure on establishing as to whether these two groups are comparable or not in the first place, because there was no pretest that was conducted for this type of experimental research design, the static group comparison design. So for this design, there is a sufficient control for threats number 4, 7, and 9. I'm sorry, this is threats number 4. That means on the instrument decay. And they have a control for testing, which is number 7. And then for number 9, they have a certain control for maturation as well. Why is it that there is a certain control for maturation? Because you are comparing two groups. So you are able to tell whether this is attributed to maturation or not, because there is a certain group that are being compared in the first place. You are comparing two groups. One group receiving a flexible learning mechanism, and another group simply being taught using the traditional residential or the face-to-face teaching and learning process. Another design is on the static group pretest and post-test design. So this static group pretest and post-test design have also the same level of controls as the previous one, which is the static group comparison design. So in this case, there is already a pretest that have been conducted. So two existing or intact groups are again used, and these groups are not equivalent nor randomly assigned, but there was a measurement prior to the treatment that was given. So we have a pretest here, and then after that there was a post-test that was conducted. And I've seen this design very common or commonly adopted in several studies in the basic education, particularly in some of the action researches that have been done by teachers. This is quite a good design, particularly when you are limited to the number of students that you have, which is the case of the basic education, particularly in the provinces. Alright, so at this point, we'll move to the true experimental designs. There are 5 of them, and of these 5, I put together next to each other sets of designs that are in a way similar, and the only difference is that one used a matched group as opposed to the other who is actually using a full randomization. So let's go to randomized post-test only control group design. For randomized post-test only control group design, the symbolisms or the illustration that are usually used when you are presenting your designs is shown at the rightmost corner, top right corner of your screen. So you have your treatment group and your control group. And if you notice here, this is only post-test. But one thing that is unique with this design is that there was a randomization that was conducted before the study was before the treatment was actually given, no? So meaning there was a random selection of the respondents. After they were randomly selected, they were randomly assigned. So if the situation still about a researcher wanting to determine if flexible learning mechanism of DepEd improves student study habits, then at the onset of the study, from the population, a certain number of students, say 100, were randomly selected. After they were randomly selected, they were then randomly assigned to the treatment group or to the control group. And then the experiment unfolds as you introduce the treatment, in this case, the flexible learning mechanism, and then towards the end, or by the end of the school year, there was a post-test that was conducted. Actually, hindi yan post-test lang yan kasi walang pre So walang post. So there was a test, there was a measurement that was conducted, the study habit scale was actually implemented. Now, the other one, which is the matched group, post-test only design, is different from the randomized post-test only design because of a particular peculiarity. What is that? At the onset of the study, there were already students that were paired. Okay? So when we say 50 pairs of students match on a certain criteria, we are talking about 100 students here all in all. And in this 100 students, there were 50 pairs that were created. Each of the pair, presumably based on a matching criteria, have the same characteristics. What were the basis of the matching criteria? Of course, your literature review. The factors that were previously identified by other studies that have effect or that have known effects to your particular outcome of the study. So using that matching criteria now, you did match a certain group of students. Now from the pairs of students that you have, you then assign them randomly either to the control group or to the experimental group. And then the process continues similar to that of the randomized post-test only control group design. So take note also of the notations. For the randomized post-test only control design, your notations it's represented by R, while for the match groups it's represented by M sub R. Okay? So let's go to the third one, which is randomized pre-test post-test control group design. So in this design, you have already a pre-test and a post-test. So what happened is that after you randomly selected 100 students, you randomly assign them, you then provide them with a pre-test. After the pre-test, the treatment was introduced, and then you conducted a post-test. You then compare whether the difference between the two groups, between pre-test and post-test, varies significantly. So this is where your randomized pre-test post-test control group design. So when we talk about the matching only pre-test post-test control group design, what happens is that at the onset, you have already identified your pairs. And from these pairs, you randomly assign them to the groups. And then the process continues of doing a pre-test, introducing the treatment, and doing a post-test. So again, in this illustration, we are using the same situation, which is a researcher wanting to determine if flexible learning mechanism of DepEd improves students' study habits. Now, a very interesting design, and this is one of the designs that have sufficient controls, if not all, but most, to the threats of internal validity, is the Solomon 4 group design. So as an illustration of the Solomon 4 group design, it is presented in this form. No? Essentially, there are 4 groups. What are these 4 groups? All of these 4 groups were actually randomly selected and randomly assigned. Now the first pair, if you look at, were given pretest and post-tests. Now the remaining two pairs of treatment and control group were actually analogous to the post-test only. So it's like a combination of the randomized pretest post-test control group design and the randomized control group design. So that is the Solomon four-group design. So let's try to illustrate this further. So using the same situation, here, let's say you've randomly selected 200 students. From the 200 students, 50 were randomly assigned to Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, and Group 4. And then from there, the first two groups, Group 1 and Group 2, were given pretests, while Groups 3 and Group 4 were not given pretest. Now, what is the reason why Group 3 and Group 4 were not given pretest? This is actually a certain control for what we call maturation. Okay, so we are doing this, or this particular design, or this particular post-test only control group design as being presented for Groups 3 and Group 4 is a way of controlling for maturation. So now, after the pretest that has been given to Groups 1 and Group 2, the treatment is being given now to all groups. Of course, for the control group face-to-face, and then afterwards there was a post-test that was given to all four groups. So that is actually the Solomon four-group design. Okay. So now let's move to the quasi-experimental design. So the quasi-experimental design features three designs: matching only design, counterbalance design, and one of my favorite, time series designs. When we say matching only design, what is happening here is that random assignment is not utilized. Subjects or respondents in the experimental and control group are only matched, and there is this use or access to intact groups. What do we mean by this? So first, there is no random assignment. Second, the subjects or the respondents in the experimental and control group are matched, but you simply used intact groups. So what are the occasions that this scenario would actually happen? Let's say, following our situation, this may happen, and we have to set forth an assumption. The assumption would be each class is heterogeneous. So if they are heterogeneous, then Class A and Class B, or Section A and Section B, are almost of the same characteristics in the first place because they are heterogeneous. So having said that, in a school of two sections for grade 7 class, one class may be assigned to the control group and the other to the experimental group. So by doing this assignment, you are assigning the class, not the subject or the student. It is the entire group that is being assigned to the experimental group, not the students in that class, but the entire class. Now, how are you assigning them? You can assign them randomly. You can toss a coin. If it's a head, then Section A will be the experimental. If it's a tail, then Section B will be the Section A will be the control group. So having said that, that is what we refer to as matching only design. So the researcher may also randomly assign the class to either groups. Note that the class is the one that is assigned, not the subjects or the actual respondents. Threats. What are the threats for this? Location. Why? Because let's say the class belongs to two different schools, and so if it belongs to two different schools, then maybe it's a problem, because there are no two schools that are exactly the same, no matter how you classify them similarly under typology of DepEd schools. Now, Another aspect is also on data collector's characteristics and data collector's bias. And another one is an H and J. So what is H in the first place? That is on history, and of course on the attitude of the subjects for your J. So let's try to look at some matching only designs. The first one is matching only, post-test only control group design. So in this design, as you can see, there was only a post-test that was conducted. There was a matching that's been made in intact groups. There was no pretest that was given, and we simply conducted a post-test after the treatment has been provided to our respondents. Now another variation is an inclusion of a pretest. So here, as you can see, there is already a pretest that is given prior to the intervention, and then after the intervention, a post-test was given to the subjects. Now let's try to look at counterbalance design. So the counterbalance design is very interesting, as both experimental and control intact groups are all exposed to the treatments. However, this is the twist here. The order of the exposure to said treatments varies. Now let's try to look at an illustration for this when there are actually three groups. Three groups, and let's say there are three treatments, and we call this as three treatment counterbalance designs. How will it look like? So you have groups 1, group 2, group 3. So at the onset, group 1 received the first treatment, and then there was an observation, and then the second treatment, another observation, the third treatment, and another observation. But group 2 is not receiving the first treatment. No? So kasabay doon kay group 1, ang natanggap ni group 2 is the second treatment, and so on and so forth. So this is a counterbalanced design wherein we can look into how treatments are actually affecting the groups or the groups that are being compared. In this case, of course, they are matched groups and they are intact groups. Okay. Now the time series designs can be illustrated simply by doing a repeated measurements before and after the conduct of an experiment. So X is your experiment. Before you conducted the experiment, you did some measurements. In fact, in this illustration, you did 3 measurements. And then after the treatment has been given, you conducted again another observation, in this case 3. Question: how many observations are you supposed to do before and after? Now the point there is, the observations that are conducted before and after should showcase a pattern already. So if after third observations a pattern is already very clear, that the performance of the students is really up to this level, then you can proceed into giving an experiment. Now, if the pattern is still not conclusive, then you have to continue measuring. Okay? And then after that, after the treatment has been given, you also did some measurements. You conduct some measurements, and the number of measurements would again would have something to do to the fact whether the pattern has already been revealed or not. So this is an example of a basic time series designs. Now let's try to look at some, take note of the threads. Let's try to look at some of the a time series design that is quite complex. So here, there are still 3 observations before and after a treatment. But there are how many groups? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 study groups. No? 5 studies that are being observed. So for this first group, you did a time series observation. For this group, you also did another observation. So as you can see you have 5 studies that are being compared. You can think of this as 5 different groups that are being compared, observed 3 times prior a treatment, and observed another 3 times after the treatment has been given. So I will now move to the last design, that is an addendum to the original intention. The factorial designs. Now, what is a factorial design? So this is the type of design often used when the researcher is interested to look into the interaction of the independent variable, so not the dependent variable, but the independent variable with one or more other variables. What are these other variables? These are the moderator variables. So let's have this situation. A researcher wants to determine if flexible learning mechanism of DepEd improves student study habits and whether this effect is moderated by student sexes. In other words, we are now incorporating sex as a moderator variable, meaning is the degree of effect to study habits by flexible learning mechanism consistent across gender, across sex, or consistent between male and female subjects. So in this case, the researcher intends to use matching-only predisposes control group design. So this is my assumption, and this is how it will look like. So you have a treatment and a control. No? Notice the Y1 refers to your male, the Y2 refers to your female. So for the Y1, you did some measurement before and after. For Y2, you also did some measurements before and after. All of these are randomly assigned and randomly selected. So this is an illustration of a factorial design. Now, a much simpler illustration for this is presented in this one, in this form. So you have you have sex as a variable, male, female, so that's 2. Then you have control and experimental group assignment of males and females, so that's 2. So that becomes a 2 by 2 factorial table. So more of these factorial designs are actually presented in advanced experimental designs that you may intend to perhaps enroll in further studies. And these designs allow us to control much farther for the threats. In fact, for all of the quantitative, for all of the experimental research designs, rather, it is the factorial design that has also quite a substantial level of control for threats to internal validity, particularly when that factorial design involves randomization. So meaning if there was a random assignment and random selection and random assignment, then that factorial design is quite robust compared to the other designs. So as a summary, we have the following. Experimental research essential characteristics includes 3 things: comparison of groups, manipulation of independent variable, and randomization. Threats to internal validity includes subject characteristics, mortality, location, instrumentation, which highlights instrument decay, data collector's bias, data collector's characteristics. And then you also have testing, history, maturation, attitude of subjects, regression, and lastly, implementation. Now, what are the means of controlling threats to internal validity? Detection is the key to controlling them. And after you have detected them, you can now consider them performing randomization, consider matching groups or creating matching criteria, holding such variable constant, build it in your design using subjects as their own control, or you can even implement a statistical control, which is your ANCOVA or analysis of covariance. Also, we have identified from this webinar weak experimental designs. We have also cited true experimental designs as well as quasi-experimental designs and factorial designs. Now, the nature of these designs being weak has something to do with the magnitude of threats of internal validity. We have shown, or several studies have shown, that weak experimental designs, particularly one-shot case study and one group pretest post-test design, do not have any single inch of control for threats of internal validity. As you go progress to static group comparison design, quasi-experimental design, true experimental designs, and factorial designs, the degree of controls to threats of internal validity becomes stronger. With that note, thank you for listening.